He was a lonely ghost, uttering a truth that nobody would ever hear. But so long as he uttered it, in some obscure way the continuity was not broken. It was not by making yourself heard, but by staying sane, that you carried on the human heritage. A quote from George Orwell's 1984 that has stuck with me since I finally got around to reading it, ironically enough around the same time I started this channel. This particular quote stuck with me as I embarked upon my YouTube journey and comes back to me whenever I wonder if I am wasting my time shouting into the void. It reminds me to keep going, because no matter how hard it can sometimes be to find the time to vent my views, and no matter how many or how few people those views reach, it helps keep me sane in this ridiculous world we live in. Now, obviously for most people, there are far more prominent quotes and themes from 1984 that people are drawn to. And with good reason. George Orwell's cautionary tale often appears to have manifested itself in our world. Doublethink, thought crimes, Big Brother overseeing all. Cancel culture is a prominent example of this phenomenon, alongside the reluctance to speak or even ask questions about certain topics for fear of being labelled or ostracised. The Western world seems to be imposing its own Big Brother-style authority on itself. And that brings me to what Helen McEntee and the Department of Justice has been up to lately. Her Incitement to Violence or Hatred and Hate Offences Act has passed through Dáil Éireann and is currently being debated in the Seanad, albeit on a recess while they all go on their holliers. She has also obtained a High Court order behind closed doors which requires the retention of the data of all citizens for 12 months. James Brown, a junior minister in Helen McEntee's department, also proposed an amendment that will allow the Irish Data Protection Commission to stifle and censor public discussion of a complaint if the DPC deems it to be confidential. Now, taken separately, you might, maybe, be able to find valid reasons for these actions. If we look at the retention of data for 12 months in the interest of national security, for example, we could easily link it to the Graham Dwyer case and its ramifications. Cianan Brennans has a very detailed and comprehensive explainer in the Irish Examiner as to why Ireland's history with data retention is a problem. This court order seems to me to be a ham-fisted way of getting around the EU concerns about our data retention laws under the guise of national security. The Data Protection Commission amendment could also have legitimate reasonings. I'm struggling to find any, but according to a spokesperson at the Department of Justice, it is intended to prevent investigations being procedurally tainted by undue information disclosure. So there's a reason for it, I guess. Now, with the Incitement to Hatred Act, it can be argued that hatred is a bad thing, and whipping up hatred of protected groups, especially with a view to violence against them, is something that should be criminalised. Makes sense, we must all be kind after all, and fighting against prejudiced hatred can only be a good thing, right? And of course, the current laws need to be updated to reflect the always-online world we live in. So individually, you can find possible distinct reasonings for each of these actions. However, taken together, it paints an altogether different picture. Your data is now being retained, and if you have a complaint to the Data Protection Commission, you may well find yourself muzzled as to what you can and cannot disclose publicly. Mass surveillance and a silencer. That, to me, sounds more than a little concerning. Big Brother-like even. But taken with the incredibly broad hate speech legislation, well, it becomes quite unsettling indeed. So to talk about the hate speech bill, there really are two avenues here. The first is the scope and language used in the bill itself and why people might find cause for concern. The second is whether hate speech legislation is even a good thing to begin with. And I don't think we can talk about one without the other. So let's start at the beginning, I guess. What is hate? The language used in the bill leaves quite a lot open to interpretation. Hate is not robustly defined. In fact, it's not really defined at all. It is somewhat defined in the context that it will be referred to, but not what hate actually means. It is simply stated as hatred means hatred, a circular definition which is helpful to no one. Okay, so the full quote goes on to say hatred against a person or group in the state or elsewhere on account of their protected characteristics, which, as I said, seeks to define the context in which it will be used in this bill. Right, but still, what does hatred mean here? Helen McEntee herself on primetime admitted that it was left undefined purposely, as otherwise it would be unworkable in her view. Now you might be thinking, but isn't hate easy to define? Well, yes it is, but hate is also very broad and far-reaching. A private hatred is surely causing no one any harm, right? I mean, I hate lots of things. Mushrooms, spiders, corruption, politicians. Is that wrong? So no, under this law, no, they are not wrong. But this is why the question about whether hate speech laws are a good thing is an important one to ask. Hate is a natural human emotion, just like anger. The uglier emotions, sure, the ones we try to hide, but still natural emotions. Sometimes these emotions are acceptable, even righteous. And sometimes these natural emotions cannot be rationally explained and can cause hurt or offence. But does that mean that they must not exist? That they must be stifled? I personally don't think so. Any parent will vividly remember their young child's temper tantrums. Anger, frustration, upset, all boiling over until a child becomes so overwhelmed by these big emotions that they need help to guide them back to themselves. So how do we help our children when they are dealing with these big emotions? Not by telling them that they are wrong, but by telling them that it's okay to be angry, it's okay to be upset, it's okay to be frustrated, but that it is not okay to physically act on that emotion by hitting or throwing things, for example. If a child is frustrated because a toy won't do what it's supposed to, it may seem like a good idea to tell the child that it doesn't really matter and to drop it or get over it, but that doesn't help the child in the long run. If, however, you try to understand that to the child the toy not working is their whole world at that moment, because that's what kids do, they live in the moment, then it's easier to guide them back to a place of calm, and you've done it without undermining them or making them feel as if they were being irrational. Can you see where I'm going with this? Hate is a similar emotion to anger. We can't always help what makes us angry, and we can't always help what we hate. Every one of us gets angry and every one of us hates things. And similar to the child whose toy won't work, simply telling someone to stop hating something or someone won't work. And criminalising it certainly won't help either. It will just breed resentment and even more hatred. If, for example, you meet a child's anger with anger and then tell them to calm down or else they will lose privileges, for example, you could well be in for an almighty power struggle. If, on the other hand, you try to understand where this issue, this anger, this hatred is coming from, then maybe you can try to address those fears and avoid the power struggle or backlash altogether. As I said in my video covering Ireland's immigration policy, the best way to win someone over is by answering questions and allaying fears. And let's be honest here, Star Wars wasn't wrong when it said fear leads to hate. But the funny thing is, there are things that are acceptable or even encouraged to hate. Certain types of crime are repugnant and are very acceptable to hate. It is okay to hate certain prejudices. It is okay to hate certain characteristics. Hatred is not completely taboo, and that is why free speech is important and why the hate speech bill unnerves me. The hate speech bill seeks to outlaw certain aspects of hate without considering the possible unintended side effects, all while lowering the threshold for criminality. If this law is passed, I can foresee a lot of issues. Firstly, Helen McEntee has explicitly said that she feels there were too few convictions under the current hate speech laws, and so she wants a law, as she put it, that has teeth. So what does that mean? Well, it means that An Garda Síochána will, in my opinion, be predisposed to give any complaints that fall under this heading more scrutiny, especially when the bar for criminality is so vague. I can see a lot of Garda resources and time being tied up in these cases, and as so little is defined in this law, everything must be investigated. This could mean spurious allegations made against someone will be investigated to the full extent of the law, which is quite far indeed. If a guard feels an allegation warrants investigation, well, that means that a search warrant can be issued and any devices or materials in your home or on your person can be seized indefinitely. Not only that, but any devices and materials belonging to anyone else present in your home can be seized too. Again, no time limit is specified on how long the Gardaí can keep these items. You will also be compelled to give up passwords. and the burden of proof will be on you to prove that you were not intending to share the material, which goes against the key tenet of our justice system, namely that you are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Now it will be presumed guilty unless or until you prove yourself innocent. You will have to prove that you are not going to share the content. Sounds to me a lot like having to prove yourself innocent of a thought crime. And who decides what is hateful material or content? What is the bar here? Are memes okay? Jokes? South Park episodes? I genuinely don't know the answer to that because it's not specified in the law. Common sense would dictate that no, they would be okay, but who knows? Everyone hates different things for different reasons, and there is no single person on this planet who is infallible. And if you share something that a person finds offensive online, well, all it takes is a sympathetic member of An Garda Síochána to investigate. And oh yeah, your data is now being retained for national security, so the guards won't have too much trouble finding you. We are trusting the judiciary to make a fair judgment on these matters. Now, in a fair and just society, you might be okay with that. But is our society fair and just? We have seen certain members of our society treated very differently to others. Just look at how an ordinary person is treated when there's an issue with their planning permission, compared to the numerous TDs and politicians who have lied and committed fraud on their planning permissions. Look at the difference in how a member of the elite is treated when it comes to financial issues, compared to ordinary Joe or Joanne Soap if they don't pay their TV licence. There is no trust in our judiciary, so why would we trust them with such a far-reaching law as the hate speech bill? And then there is the incitement to hatred aspect. Content shared doesn't have to actually incite anyone to violence or hatred, and doesn't even have to be shared with the express intent of causing incitement. It just has to be reckless. So you are now responsible for the actions of others. And what is incitement to hatred? Facts can cause hatred. How many people, after hearing the various facts surrounding RTE, would now say they hate RTE and what it stands for? Obviously, that's not a protected characteristic, but still, it's an example of incitement to hatred. What about the hatred generated towards politicians every single time they are caught out being corrupt or unethical? Facts, simply put, can incite hatred. So will facts that people find offensive now be criminalised? Any law that is so vague and so open to interpretation is just as open to abuse. The greatest fear would be that this law can be used to silence dissenters, critics, or people you just don't agree with. All it takes is an accusation and a sympathetic guard for someone's life to be turned upside down, and it doesn't take a prosecution to silence someone. The confiscation of devices and materials coupled with the mere threat of prosecution could well be enough to put the fear of God in people and silence them. A chilling effect, if you ask me, and one that will see people questioning what they are and are not allowed to say, and unduly censoring themselves. Now that might sound like a conspiracy theory, but for me, conspiracy theories stop being conspiracy theories when they are actually possible within the confines of the law. And this law allows for this sort of thing to happen. Just because it may not happen straight away does not mean it does not have the capacity to happen. Helen McEntee assures us that causing offence and criticising will not be prosecuted, but do we believe her? I know there is a section about what constitutes a valid defence, which is a reasonable and genuine contribution in relation to literary, artistic, political, scientific, religious or academic discourse, which means a contribution that is considered by a reasonable person as being reasonably necessary or incidental to such discourse. But is that enough? I personally don't think so. I feel the bar is very low for accusations, investigations and prosecutions, but very high for a reasonable defence. And everything is open to interpretation. To me, this law is trying to do too much without consideration to the consequences, intended or otherwise. I can see what it is trying to do. Certainly, trying to incite people to violence based on hate speech is something that no progressive society should tolerate, but I personally feel that this can be dealt with using our current laws and common sense. Over 70% of respondents to a public consultation were not in favour of this law, yet it is being pushed ahead. And while the bill will not be debated again until the summer recess is over, I can't help but feel that it will be passed into law despite the obvious flaws. One big problem with politics is that ego often overrides the best course of action. Politicians would rather push through a piece of legislation, regardless of how unworkable it is, as a matter of pride. They would rather something unfit for purpose than have egg on their face and admit they got it wrong. I feel that this is happening here. Ultimately, I think that this law will be passed, and only when someone challenges a prosecution will we get to see just whether or not this law is constitutional. So what do you think? Am I being paranoid? Am I overreacting to what will end up being a very useful piece of legislation? Does Ireland really have such an issue with extremists that this law is necessary? Or are we headed down a draconian, Orwellian path where freedom of expression is curtailed and silenced in the name of progress? Let me know in the comments below what you think. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe and hit that bell icon to be notified of new content. If you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee, which is greatly appreciated, and a big thank you to those that already have. You can also follow me on Twitter for my real-time reactions. Until next time, slán go fóill.